Right, well, there's some of my cars there. Um, Classic cars, old cars. Very difficult to talk about the future of the cars, in my opinion, without talking about politics and social ideology. I think I listen to a lot of people talking about classic cars, old cars, and I listen to a lot of people talking about other activities and hobbies. And I get depressed sometimes because there seems to be a naivety about it that is, well, starting off, I suppose, the usual things that people of my age were involved in. Stamp collecting, coin collecting, cigarette card collecting, basically collecting lots of things, playing chess, and other activities that you don't really see now. Well, I don't think they're around as much as they were. Certainly stamp collecting and the ones I've said, I don't believe are as popular or, or even around. Anyone's doing them now. Now, when I was young, there were cars that you bought new, there were second-hand cars, old bangers, and that was about it. And there were also some vintage cars, or cars that you might be described, I don't even think they were described as classic cars, but they might be described as classic cars. We've got the vintage and veteran cars, which were the really old ones, which people that had money had, and they'd race in England here, and they raced them from London to Brighton and that sort of thing. These were cars that were made in the early part of the 20th century, because we're talking about a time of the mid 20th century. So looking back, these cars were about 50 years old. And so but the big difference between those cars, that were built in maybe 1904 or 1908, and compare them to cars that were built in 1949 to, say, 1950, that sort of period, which is what I'm talking about, the 50s, late 40s, early 50s, and mid 50s. So there was a big difference in the technology. Going back. So in the 60s, then we move into the 60s. Now the 60s was socially a very was a period of big change for society. Cars and vehicles, personal transportation for everyone became really available. Holidays became available. Lots of consumer goods became available. Consumer goods in the house, tools. The world as we kind of know it now really started in the 60s, because before that, either these things weren't readily available, because we had the problems after the war. I'm talking really the UK, but we had problems after the war with shortages and everything. And then before the war, a lot of these things didn't exist. But when they did exist, they were only available for people that had a lot of money. So for the mass population, suddenly everyone really had access to everything, from music, books, food, all these things that we take for granted were suddenly in a very big, a big supply, a ready supply. And then we get to the point where people started to indulge in hobbies, not just playing chess and checkers and playing cards, which is and board games, which is sort of things we used to do. People began to get involved in activities where they spent money, and they had cars. They went out for drives in their cars on the weekend or in the evening. They traveled. They were able to travel to different locations, different towns, and get involved in hobbies. Well, in England, I'm talking about dog shows, for example, where people would drive 50 miles, 100 miles, and back in a day to go to a dog show. They model airplane. I mean, all sorts of activities. Went to visiting country houses and all this sort of thing. This stuff didn't really exist to the masses, for the masses, before the war. So the 60s opened everything up. Young kids went to pop concerts. They went out to different places on their own. They had transport. They started to have scooters and mopeds and then cars. And then during the 70s, I think the late 60s, 70s, people started showing an interest in older cars, because when you had a car that was made in 1970, it was a fairly modern car. Even today, it had all the bits and pieces that a modern car has. But if you look back 30 years before that, so a car that was built in the 20s, or in the 40s even, technically it was not the same car. Now, I remember when I bought a 1957 Lincoln in the late 70s. It seemed, and it was, a mile away from the cars of that period. Cars that were new in 1979 or 1977, for example. When you compare that to the Lincoln Premier that I bought, that was from 1957, there was really little comparison. But if I look at my Mercedes, for example, which is 30 years old, so the same difference, 30-year difference, there isn't so much, there isn't such a big difference in the technology and the performance and even the styling to a certain extent. So this difference in technology and styling and everything else, especially styling, I think, created this real interest in cars, also old cars. And then another thing that happened, of course, in the 70s, was that there was a generation of people who, including myself, who was suddenly financially set up to be able to indulge in buying cars that up until then were just considered to be old cars, but they bought them because they reminded them of their childhood, or they reminded them of a car that they lusted after, as it were, when they were children or younger. And suddenly they could afford to buy one of these cars because they were suddenly old cars on the market and the prices were not that great, and they were buying them. So, and then of course this old car business, this interest in old cars, developed into the genre of classic cars, and it grew and grew and grew, and we then got to the point where older cars were never really scrapped if there was any possibility that they could be restored, and then they would have a home in the classic car market. So what I'm really saying is that that was a phenomenon that was a one-off during that period. Now, it didn't happen before that, obviously, because cars are only 50 years old after the war, from the time they were first created. And now we're coming to the end of, apparently, combustion engine cars. And we're producing cars now which are not going to be that easy to maintain as an older vehicle when parts are not available for them because of the electronics involved. So I think that the classic car industry or market or hobby, really, as we know it or understand it to be now, is not sustainable. It's not going to happen. Something may well replace it, but it isn't going to be the hobby that we've seen for the last maybe 25 years, 30 years. where we go from here is very interesting, because there's a lot of money invested at the moment in these cars, and that's not just in the ownership of them, but it's also in the maintenance of them, spare parts, repairs, and so on. But you can see already what's happening. People who have been working in the industry, for example, of repairing old cars, maintaining them, as they now get older and retire and fall off the tree, as it were, they're not being replaced. And businesses, old garages basically, that looked after old cars, are closing down and disappearing, and they're not being replaced. So it is getting more and more difficult to find somebody to look after your car. You know, how many mechanics now, or engineers, or technicians, whatever you want to call them, know how to really tune and work on a carburetor? Not that many. Now you may, or listening to this, and say, oh yes, well, there's 4 or 5 guys in my street or my local area, but there certainly isn't around here where I am. And I'm finding it extremely difficult to find people that are competent enough to actually look after these cars properly. And this is a factor as well. So I wonder what is going to happen. At the moment, I think where we are at this moment in time, everyone talks about the price of classic cars rising. Well, there is a reason for that as well. It's not simply that they're classic cars, it's that you take a car that's 30, 40 years old, you could drive that as an everyday car now. And if you did that, you would save yourself a lot of money, because buying a new car now, especially if it's going to be electric, is very expensive. You've got all the testing, and you've got all the emission areas, zones that are being created in the UK, where you have to pay to drive your car daily if it's after older than a certain age, for example. But that doesn't last forever, because when it reaches a certain point, i.e. historical registration, in other words, it's declared as an historical vehicle, you can have a waiver on this. So people are finding that they're better off buying an old car that's been maintained. It's cheaper to run, cheaper to buy, relatively speaking, and they can drive it around without paying all these penalty charges at the moment. Now, where that's going to happen with legislation, who knows? Who knows? We're only guessing, because the general feeling amongst the people that have the reins, hold the reins of power, it seems, want combustion engines, and possibly even freedom of personal transportation curtailed or got rid of, to save the planet and for our own good, apparently. I won't talk about any of these things. You can probably guess my feelings, but I don't want to turn this into a political channel. So I think as far as the cars are concerned, I have great doubts as to what will happen in, say, another 4 or 5 years. Excuse me. As we get closer and closer to the period that, or the point in time where combustion engines are going to be phased out, and maybe there'll be measures such as curtailing the availability of fuel. Maybe it'll be done through price increases. Maybe it'll be done through allocation of where you can drive the vehicle, and maybe what times you can drive the vehicle. Very difficult to say. There may be a backlash against this. But of course, if we're not building new cars, and the number of older cars naturally decreases, that means that there'll be less people anyway who will be supporting the demand to have these old cars still on the road. So either way, they're going to end up like the horse and cart, and they're going to be a technology from a bygone age, and will be of interest, and there'll be some amount of cars on the around on the roads probably, but how many, what models, and I think, like horses and carts, where they still carried on to a point, they had to be cared for, and they had to be looked after, as it were, and they had to be maintained and kept, these horses. And, very few people were in a position to do that. And these people had money usually, and they showed their horses off, or still do, in county fairs and all this sort of thing. But they're not part of the infrastructure of the society or transportation, really. And I think this could happen with combustion engine cars, or at least I'm sure this is what some people would want. Now, at this point, I actually have to run out of steam, because I don't really want to get into the topic of electric cars and how and why I don't believe they're the answer. And if they're not the answer, then, are we going to take personal transportation away from people? And if so, what will it happen, and what will be the result of the attempt of it happening? So these are all political issues, really, and social issues, which I don't want to get into in this channel. So I just think that because of all these factors, we're not going to have a classic car future, as it were, in the way that many people think or talk about. Therefore, I've got great doubts as to, personally, how much time and money I want to spend now investing in older cars. It is actually just an indulgence for me anyway, because I've never considered any of the cars that I have had or still have as being of any value. If they have, all right, but it's not what I've had them for, and that's not why I spent money on them. I spent money on them and maintained them because I wanted to. I enjoyed owning them, and I still do. And I have no real desire at this moment in time, to get rid of any of the cars that I do have. And almost every day I see an advert for a car which I think, oh, I'd love to buy that one, and maybe I will. At the moment, I'm just at a real crossroads, though, as to where this whole car hobby is really going. Finally, I'll finish off by saying there's another factor as well. I mean, there's lots of points in this that I have not mentioned or discussed in this video, but I think another factor is that young people, on average, do not have the desire, the fire about cars that we had when I was young. When I was young, cars were the biggest thing that interested a lot of us fellas. Every year, the car manufacturers would be bringing out the latest models, and there would be new models every year. We went to the car shows. We went to the car show and motor show in London, here in England, and we went to this show every year. We bought magazines. We read all about the new cars. In America, adverts would be coming on the television, be coming into the new season, so that they would be announcing all the latest models. Well, that doesn't really happen now, and cars are just cars, and they're just, for most people that I know now, the younger people, they're just a means of transportation. They have no real interest, and they don't seem to have the real prestige that they had in later years. There was a time when you could gauge somebody's position in society by the car they drove. Certainly in America, when you drove even a Ford, it was what model Ford, and even that one particular model had different trim levels. So it's like when you work for a company, the higher up you were in the company, you got the same car, but you got a different trim level. And these things, okay, perhaps they exist to a point now, but not in the way that they used to. So I think that there's a generation now who are the generation that's actually probably now going to be spending most of the money. They're the bulk the people in the middle, probably maybe from their late 20s, to late 40s and middle 50s. They're the people who have got the biggest buying power, perhaps. I don't think that they're as interested in cars as we used to be. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's the way I feel. So I don't think that the great interest in cars is going to be there in another decade. So there won't be such a demand even for people wanting to buy old cars. So I think the demand's going to go. I think the ability for cars to be driven is going to go. I think a lot of cars won't be able to be maintained. And then, of course, you've got the question that the government will be maybe taking measures proactive measures to get these cars off the road. And what and if there will be vehicles to replace them is a political issue. We'll see. So maybe my words are very controversial, and maybe most of you don't agree with me. I understand that, but that's the way I feel. And I'll leave it there, I think. So this is a strange little video. I'm walking my dog around here in circles in the wood, and talking about cars. And there we go. So I think I'm going to have a cup of tea, and then I might well look at some pictures of cars, actually, in the classic car magazine that I've got this week, and drool over some of the ones that I really would like to buy. Okay, that's it. Tell me what you think.